tell you how I made the connection with the folks from Yankee. I want to give you a little bit of background about this area and what excited the Yankee magazine and its writers and photographers. Let me give you a little bit of background about where we live. Now, some of you people have been to my earlier lectures. I ask you to bear with me because there's a little redundance here, but there's a lot of people who have not heard of the geology of this area and what created a situation that would attract people. And when you have people, then you have paths, and when you have civilized people, then you have roads. And we like to think we're civilized, and we have lots of roads here. So in order to do this, we're going to go back in time to the last glacier to understand what happened here, what created a situation that would entice people to travel great distances to live here in the Brookfields, in Warren, in the area that we're most concerned with. The Wisconsin Glacier, some 15,000 years ago, reached down from the northwest across this area and down into the ocean south of and east of Connecticut. And above us here was a sheet of ice nearly 2 miles high. Now think in those terms right now, because you have to think in those terms to understand the next series of events that occurred. Now as that glacier moved down across New York State, across New England, it picked up rocks and ground them up, moved several hundred yards of a cushion of rock that actually acted as ball bearings. And when it got down to a point just to the west of West Warren, Devil's Peak and Colonel's Mountain. Are you all familiar with that area along Route 67 where the Quabog winds its way down behind those mountains? The glacier started to melt some 12,000 years ago, and it left a rubble dam there. And behind that dam, a huge lake built up and went all the way to the Tenerife in East Brookfield, the mountains in North Brookfield, and along Town Farm Road and all the mountains that you see and hills you see there. We're sitting right here at about 610 feet above sea level. The river's sitting just about 600 feet above sea level. Foster Hill would have been underwater, and that's 765 feet above sea level because the mountains surrounding us run anywhere from 900 to 1,100 feet in height. The ice started to melt. This huge lake filled up, and for 2,000 years, sediment settled at the bottom of this lake. We're actually sitting at the bottom of this lake. Sediment deposited this real thick layer of soil. And some 10,000 years ago, the dam breached. And if you go down Route 67, and this is a good time to do that, heading towards Palmer, look towards the Quabog River at the rubble in that river and on the river sides. And that stretches all the way beyond 3 rivers. Over 2 trillion gallons of water poured down through that area and into the Connecticut River, changed the shape of the landscape. After the water had left, this became a virtual Garden of Eden. Tubers grew, berries grew here in great numbers, fruit grew here, and that attracted animals. But it also attracted someone else. From the south and west of this country came another group of people. These we call Indians. And they moved into the area as the glacier moved back across Massachusetts. They actually came up in the southwest and they moved into Ipswich. Now we have a wonderful Ipswich connection with the Brookfields too. Remember the first settlers in Quabog came from Ipswich? But up at Bold Brook, some 10 to 12,000 years ago, we had Indians living there. But we know that here in the Brookfield, 6,000 years ago, we had people living here. And that's remarkable when you realize that the pyramids were built some 4,000 years ago. So we're talking 500 generations of people lived here before we arrived. Now, from the southwest, another feature occurred. Some of Walter's displays here, the atlatl, was the weapon of choice. And then the bow and arrow appeared in the scene some 800 to 1,000 years ago. And corn arrived simultaneously from Mexico, from the south and from the west. As a matter of fact, the Indians in this area believed that their ancestors had come out of a hole in the ground, somewhere to the south and the west of where we are now. Well, with the change that occurred with corn and with the bows and arrows, these Indians were no longer gatherers and hunters. They became farmers. And they began to settle this land and stay here. They didn't wander around very much. But we had Englishmen here Remember a little earlier I said we had Englishmen here much earlier, much earlier than the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims came here in 1620. Of course, and they moved down into Plymouth in 1629. The Massachusetts Charter was in place, and people came from England and settled in what became the Massachusetts colony. But in 1568, in the Gulf of Mexico, an English ship, probably a pirate ship, went aground, and all hands were lost but 3. These 3 men made their way ashore in the Gulf of Mexico, came up through Mexico following the same general path that the Indians followed, went to the north and to the east, and they passed somewhere through this area. Fellows' names, one of them was David Ingram, another went by the name of Brown, and the third was the name of Twide. And they went to the north and to the east, thinking that they would run into some of the European fishing boats off the coast of North America. They had been fishing here for a great long time, and sure enough they did. Off New Brunswick, they ran into a French ship which took them to Europe, and in turn they went to England. And when they got there, no one had ever done this before. So these very poorly educated sailors invented this story. They embellished on that story enormously. And there were people living here who had no heads, who had mouths in their chests, and things that you would not believe. But apparently they did this for money because they were very successful. But after a while, nobody believed them. But they did pass through here, and it's interesting to know that. Now, here we sit, and Boston is here. In 1633, we have the beginning of civilization. Mr. Oldham is going to come from Boston to Hartford. Now, heretofore, one had to sail around the Cape, down at the Long Island Sound, and up the Connecticut River to reach the Connecticut River Valley towns. He thought he would try going overland, and this is the orange route you see in 1633. He left Boston, traveled west to Wayland, and then moved south. He moved south until he passed into Manchester, Connecticut, and into Hartford. And you can follow the route that he followed. But in so doing, it was very, very uncomfortable traveling. It took weeks upon weeks to make that journey. And he traveled it with some 40 people. And they had a terrible journey. It wasn't the recommended way to go, but it was the only one they knew. 1640. Englishmen are living along the Connecticut River, and they're living out in the Boston towns. They know virtually nothing about the interior. And it's a good reason for that. Richard Slotkin wrote a thesis on regeneration through violence, and he talks about the Puritan mindset. He said, my God, they're not going to go into the interior. Englishmen, Puritans, were afraid of the dark. The woods are dark. They were afraid of things they didn't know. They weren't going to leave civilization. Sure enough, when Massachusetts developed, they did it through the webbing procedure. They'd go a few miles away from an existing town and start another town, with one exception. In 1660, we changed the webbing procedure forever. The most remote English town in North America, right here in the Brookfields, top of Foster Hill and on Devil's Elbow Road. 30 miles from Marlborough, 30 miles from Springfield. Puritans living here, unbelievable. They were here for many reasons. I'll get into some of them in a few minutes. The English began to learn in Boston, began to learn a little bit about the interior in 1640, when Chief Popham Fawcett, anyone who knows South Pond knows it's called Popham Fawcett Pond. Well, it's after Chief Popham Fawcett lived down at Quabog Old Fort, which was just north of Lake Sherman. He complained. He sent a complaint to the General Court in Boston saying Onico, who was son of Uncas, had come up. He was a Mohegan from Connecticut and had attacked the local Quabogs and killed 6 of his people. And he wanted the English to come with guns. Well, in his wisdom, the governor approached Mr. Pynchon in Springfield and said, investigate. Mr. Pynchon investigated and said, a lot of Indians around there, but only a handful of them report to a single man. So there's no point in having a liaison with these folks. We don't know who we're dealing with. We don't know really what we're dealing with the Mohegans as well, so we'll do nothing. And sure enough, they did nothing. And 2 years later, the General Court, now they've been stimulated. Let's find out a little bit about this. So they hired Woodward and Sappery to do a survey. And they did a hell of a survey. Their line went in a straight line from Boston to Springfield, so you know they didn't make the trip. They didn't make the trip at all. And they missed everything that was east of Spencer. Because then they started to talk a little bit. There's a few lakes show up here and there, and a wigwam here and there. I'm sure there were many more wigwams. They missed a few of them. But what they did was they mentioned the hills of Spencer. They mentioned our lakes in the Brookfields. They mentioned the Pine Plains in Wilbraham. So Woodford and Sassery focused attention. It's interesting to note that the scale on that map, they said that in a straight line from Quabog to Springfield was 26 miles, and from Springfield to Boston was 96.5 miles. They hit it right on the head. But they were seafaring men, and they understood latitude and longitude, and they could set up a set of circumstances where they could, indeed, figure exactly how far it was between 2 points. So I suppose that's their credibility. Now we begin to get modern. 1649, John Bradford. He's the son of the governor. In his diary, he says, today a new way has been found to Connecticut. The new way. This is our Orange Path. Orange Path went up to Princeton and Barry, New Braintree, along Lake Road here in West Brookfield, down Milk Street, up Long Hill, and on to Brimfield and Steerage Rock. This is the new road. This is the good road. It didn't last very long because they found a better way. 1673, in anticipation of a war, the White Road here. You can see the White Road. Surprising enough, it pretty well follows the Post Road, the northern route of the Post Road, with some great exceptions. From Boston into just north of Marlborough, Lancaster, Spencer. We miss Worcester, because Worcester is really, it's defined as being a place of hills, wolves, and rattlesnakes. So Worcester, even though it later became our shire town, wasn't very popular. And it was difficult to negotiate the topography there. Passed through Spencer, East Brookfield, went through the Warrens, and on its way into Springfield. This was the military path, and a great deal of this road still exists in pristine shape off the beaten path into Brookfield. Some of our tours have taken you folks on different ends of the military highway of 1673. The old stone bridges still exist on those roads. We are privileged to have this wonderful piece of history still here. And I want you to know these writers from Yankee went through this. They went through this. 12 whole cassettes they got before they could analyze what they were going to keep and what they were going to put into this article. So anyway, we get to the military highway, but at the same time, these Connecticut River Valley towns are beginning to fill up, and the general court makes a judgment that we're going to also create a road to Hadley. Sure enough, as you start out towards the Rock House and you follow the Route 9 towards Ware until you come to the turnoff of Lucy Stone's place, then up over Coy Hill, down across the Narrows and Ware and onto Belchertown, the Hadley Path was created in 1673. Now we're going to get to our friend Benjamin Franklin. In 1753, we're still Englishmen. We are still Englishmen. We haven't fought the good war yet. Benjamin Franklin is an assistant postmaster. We have 2 of them. And depending on who's working, he becomes the postmaster while the other one loafs. Back and forth it went. Well, on a given day, Benjamin was the postmaster. And he was charged with the responsibility of engineering a method of moving the mail. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island were certainly the population centers at that time. The first year of the Revolutionary War was fought right here. The power and the resources of this country really were massed in one place, although New York, Pennsylvania, and some of the southern states were beginning to gain size, population, and power. So he designed a system. Now, heretofore, when you sent a letter, you just mailed it. It didn't cost you anything. The poor soul getting the letter may not know it was coming, but he was the fellow that paid the bill. And the reason for that was the fellow carrying the mail couldn't be guaranteed he'd be paid until he found the scoundrel who was supposed to get the letter. Do you see why it made sense? Benjamin had the job to change that around, and he did. He created a series of roads, 3 roads. You had the northern, the central, and the southern road, and there's a Providence connector. And along that road, we were Yankees. We didn't like to pay for anything. We were also suspicious of a strong central government. We still are. At any rate, he decided that if it was a fair rate and everyone paid the same, as bad as it was, these rural farmers would pay their share. And sure enough, they did. They grumbled and all, but they paid their share. We came up with a system of marking every mile along the way, and the post was priced depending on how many of those markers your letter passed. And I'll get into that a little later on. But let me give you the Yankee connection right now before we get back into those details. 2.5 years ago, the telephone rang, and it was Mr. Bob Payne. He's a noted writer. He writes for many, many magazines. And he said that he was so excited about the post road, he had actually walked this thing from Boston to New York, trying to find the road. And he said he couldn't find people with credentials to show him where most of the road was. Could I help him? Oh, he was wonderful. I had just retired. I had all the time in the world, and Yankee magazine has always been something that I found very special. So sure, I said, come on down and we'll talk. And we spent 3 days talking. And I took him to this Leicester line, and we followed every surviving foot of the old post road. We wandered off of Route 9, back onto Route 9, up over Elm Hill Farm, through up Pond in Warren, up over the back hills, all the way to the turnpike, almost into Palmer, the backside of West Warren. And then they sent a photographer, Richard Schultz, really nice young fellow. And he hadn't been doing this very long. He caused Nancy and I some considerable grief, and I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. But he came along and he spent 2 days. And my God, he shot over 500 shots, different things along that road. I didn't know there were 500 things to look at. He got them all. He got some poor farmer up on top of Reed Street in Warren, and he took so many pictures of him pulling up multi-floor roses out of his pasture. The poor guy had his pasture cleaned before the pictures were done. But at any rate, and he didn't even get his picture in the magazine. That's a sad part of it. But at any rate, we traveled this road, and he went away to write his story. And we had many, many more contacts with Mr. Payne. Then I got a call from Yankee magazine. Listen, we have to have maps. We have to have maps. Do you have a map? Well, I said, yes, I have a map that I have drawn for the Quaboag Historical Society that lists 100 historic places in all of the greater Brookfields, the 7 towns that made it up. I missed the Rock House. Didn't find that historically significant at the time. At any rate, so we got a hold of Mr. Early, and Mr. Early, who has some of these maps, incidentally, if you want to buy them today, you can find out where you're at if you get one. He sent him a map, and sure enough, the cartographer took a little bit of license. But you have to bear with me. I dropped this and I lost my markers. Right across 2 pages, if you'll notice, see this red line? It's taken from that, and it shows many of our local areas. Slab City Road, it shows Elsie the Board Cow, on and on it goes. Bathsheba Spooner's Place, nobody ever misses Bathsheba, all the way down to Route 67 and heading towards Warren. Well, the cartographer said, you know, I sent him this map here, and he said, wow, that's great, but I can't make that small enough where you can read it in this magazine. So the editor called and said, may we take liberties with your post road? And I said, of course you can. And they did. They took a lot of liberties, but they did a good job. Here's the map. There's only 2 or 3 towns labeled on it, but they show all the routes, very nicely done, so at least people will understand that they've had the same routes as defined here, had their origin in Boston, and end up in New York City. Now the editor called and he talked to me and he says, you know, this was supposed to be a 19-page article, but we've got these wonderful, wonderful full-page photographs. We're going to use those, so it's going to reduce it to less than 19 pages. And, well, I had nothing to do with that. I wasn't writing it. I was just assisting. And then he says, it's Thanksgiving. We've got to have more recipes. So we ended up with 15 pages. And I'm going to tell you some of the stuff they didn't put in there. I was cross. Well, he talked to me, and I got better right away. Because I can understand. They know more about their business than I do. But This same Richard Schultz, this wonderful young man, took all these pictures. Then he went off to photograph a war in Europe somewhere, and he didn't identify many of the pictures. I got a call from Yankee. We're going to send you the pictures. See if you can find out where these places are and who these people are. So Nancy and I got that same little red pickup you see pictured in there, and we started up and down that post road all day long. We finally ended up finding everybody but a house that had a little white goat behind it. We never did find the goat. He must have escaped because we found everything else. We found the pumpkin patch. We found the wagon. There was a little girl pulling a wagon, but we couldn't find out who the little girl was. She was a customer's daughter. However, this fellow had taken a lot of liberties. He lay down in the street in Brookfield, and we see 2 or 3 cars a day there, and that's risky. But he actually laid down just when the sun was right, and he shot the steeple of the Congregational Church, and it was the most incredible picture you could ever imagine, and it didn't make the magazine because they didn't have enough room. Many of the buildings in this town were treated in the same fashion. But you have to understand why they did it, because he explained, we're not catering to historians alone. We're catering to people who just like the good old days. They like things that are historic and survive. They like to know about these things. They like these quirky little quaint New England things that we have. Well, some of the things that he didn't include was the details of the first settlement, the frontier, 1665, the town. I held him up there for half a day trying to explain to him what happened, and he didn't share my enthusiasm. He was a Boston boy. He didn't appreciate the fact we went and saved their butts either, and I told him that in no uncertain terms. If we didn't pay attention, we'd never do it again. So he promised me the world, but he didn't deliver, so I was upset about that too. And then when we got to Warren, where the old post road actually goes under Cummings Pond, runs right up to the pond and then comes out on the other side. It's called Cummings Pond now, but it used to be Brigham's Pond. And I says, you really got to do this. When I was a kid, you used to go out there by the island and dive, and you could actually walk along the road underwater. I said, that's important. Well, he didn't think it was, and he didn't include it. And then when you came out on the other side, Mr. Jerhusky lives over there, and there's a small lane called Bay Path Road. And this Devil's Elbow, this second Devil's Elbow in Warren. But what was significant about that was the field just to the left as you came out of the pond. And that's where Burgoyne's army, after we had smashed it, it was on its way to be incarcerated, and they camped there overnight. And I thought that was important. And particularly when you read this German lieutenant's diary, and he says the people in Brookfield were very hospitable and very gracious. And the people in the towns on both sides of that were horrendous examples of Englishmen. People in Warren, Spencer. Wow. I think you were mad at King George. Well, at any rate, there were some other things that I wanted to tell you that were important right here in West Brookfield. On top of the hill, and I don't want to take anything away from the old tavern that sat on this side, but on top of Foster Hill, Rice had a tavern. As a matter of fact, Rice's Tavern is very prominent because the first stage wagon, this is much earlier than stagecoaches. This came before the stagecoaches. The first stage wagon stopped there in 1782 bearing passengers. It also carried the mail. Now this is probably the inn that Washington stopped at, and the lady said, we don't have room for you, and he went down the road. Well, tradition has it he stopped in Brookfield and went to Spencer. Well, that's nonsense. Why would he pass the huge Woolcut Inn on Slab City Road, which is in North Brookfield? Made absolutely no sense at all. But you know what tradition does to our history. So anyway, I thought that was important that he did comment a little bit about the inn, but he didn't really do as well as I hoped he'd do on that. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about the mail, because we grumble and we groan and we complain about 32 cents to mail a letter. We can mail a letter to Hawaii for 32 cents. But there was a young boy, his name was Charles Howe, and he was born in Brookfield in 1830. And he happens to talk about many, many things of everyday life as it affects a young boy and his family during the 1830s, 1840s, the time frame, his formidable years, if you will. And Mr. Howe has an aunt in Japan. She's working for a missionary there. But that's a horror story. I won't go into that when we talk about postage. Just let me tell you what he had to say about the postage. And I have a letter here from this period. I'm not going to pass it around. It's very delicate. No stamps on it. Nothing like that. It's an onion skin type of paper. And the poor soul was written on every square inch except the address that they possibly could. I'm sure they'd write on the edge if they could have. Let me tell you why you get more bang for the buck. Because in 1830, 1840, middle-class Americans were earning $1 a day for 12 hours of labor. Artisans would make as much as $1.50 a day, but they were earning $1 a day, and that was a 12-hour day. To mail a 4-sheet letter, 400 miles, cost $1. That's the equivalent of a day's pay, and the average day's pay west of $4.95 for middle-class Americans is about $8. 32 cents sounds like a real bargain, doesn't it? Now, another neat thing, that didn't include an envelope, and I won't fold it, but this was actually tucked in and folded, and a small drop of sealing wax held the letter together. We didn't have stamps then. Stamps didn't come out until 1847, and then we had a heck of a problem with that because people were using them as money. We didn't start making money till 1856. I'm talking about paper money, not coins. So people began to use stamps, and in the 1880s, Congress debated a bill on making it illegal to use stamps as currency. Well, it didn't work out that way, but they thought they might have to get into that sort of a thing to preclude the use of stamps as money. Now, Bob Payne came back one last time, touched a few details, and went across the street to the top hat, and we had lunch. And he says, I want to know about some of the local characters. And I said, well, there's no bigger character here than Milton Richardson. I'll have to go talk to him. On a good day, he's a lot of fun. And he was. He was. And then he went to Warren and talked to Milton Fountain. And Milton Fountain's also a nice guy. And we sat there talking, and the light struck. I said, we have a character like you haven't seen. And I said, this guy's an artist, and you've got to see his art. Some people can tolerate it, and other people can't. But I want you to come and see this. So I took him up Wigwam Road, and he had a chance to experience Jacob Knight's art. Oh, I have to meet this guy, and he did. I'm proud to say that later on, the editors of Yankee got together with Jacob. They had a contract. And one of the last drawings Jacob did was his Oak Bluff cover for Yankee magazine back in December of '94. And Jake died just before it was published. But that was his crowning glory. And they announced in here that he had died, and they really felt bad about that. He had formed a lasting relationship with these folks and would have gone on for years given the opportunity. Now, a month and a half ago, and this is probably one of the most exciting prospects that all of us have to deal with, particularly people that are in business. About a month and a half ago, the editor called and he says, you know what you've unleashed? And I said, no, I have no idea what I've done. I didn't know if I'd done wrong or what. He said, well, he says, we have 275,000 subscriptions going into private homes. He says, in addition to that, he says, we have many, many, many thousands of copies going to newsstands. And he said, first reading, probably 1.5 million people will read Yankee magazine. And he said, over the next several months, that will probably be 4 times as many again. And he says, traditionally, when a story like this is printed, he says, the roads, and I'm quoting him, he says, the roads will fill over the next several months by those who desire to enjoy the pristine, unspoiled artifacts of our early history. Those who just love the good old days. So what he's saying is, get ready for an onslaught. I understand we already have some people in town today from New York following this famous old Franklin